Hey everyone, and welcome to the Building Geniuses podcast, where we talk to geniuses throughout the commercial real estate and building automation industries, asking them how they've gotten where they are, who's walked alongside them, and how they're helping others along the way. This is episode 5 of season 2, and I'm your host, Tim Vogel. In today's episode, we're speaking with Rick Justis for the Coalition for Smarter Buildings. Hey Rick, welcome to the Building Geniuses podcast.
Hey Tim, how are you?
I'm fantastic. I'm very glad that you're here. So, what's interesting, Rick, so as part of like what we're trying to do with the podcast is I want to talk to lots of different people around the industry, but also I want to talk to people that have differing perspectives, have worked for different companies, even competing companies, because conversations like this span, it doesn't matter who you work for, right? Like these are conversations that really matter because how did we get where we are and how do we find success and opportunity in this industry is something that is important to everyone, and particularly new people. When they come into the industry, they have really no idea who they're coming to work for in the context of the entire industry. So tell us a little bit about you now and some of the things that you're working on.
I'm so glad you're doing this because it's right in line with what sort of my mission is personally, and then with the Coalition for Smarter Buildings, is that we need to expand the expand the tent, so to speak, in terms of how the industry works and the ideas that are coming into the industry. And yeah, a little bit of background on how it came upon where we are now and how it came to those sort of philosophies is, 100 years ago, it feels like, when I came out of college, I just wanted to do something interesting. And my grandfather has always said, that whole old cliche, you'll never work a day in your life if you're doing something that you love or it's interesting. And I worked for Honeywell right out of college because Honeywell was going to do smarter buildings. We're going to do smart building technology. And this was like in the 80s. And it just sounded like a great combination of the things I was already passionate about it way back then, which was using technology in new and innovative sort of markets and places. And I didn't stay at Honeywell very long, but I went to work basically in Silicon Valley, working for what were sort of kind of startups at the time, which was companies like Compaq, Intel, Apple, Next, and experiencing what was going on in Silicon Valley and the disruption of technology, how the new startups were disrupting the old legacy companies was just thrilling and exciting. A little bit of a nerd, so the technology piece kind of came easy, but then figuring out how to get companies and individuals to understand the technology, that became where I realized my better role was. And so telling stories and communicating, that's kind of how I grew up. My dad's in the radio news business. He always said that our family has a great face for radio, but telling stories, and I think we're proving that. But the ability to take complicated stuff and make it simple to be able to digest, and how that affects people in their careers and in their daily lives, that's always been sort of a goal. It's a challenge as well.
Yeah. And so you went to college. What was your degree in?
Well, I got a degree in business because I wanted to go into marketing, which is what my grandfather had done, but not marketing in terms of like advertising and sales marketing, but marketing as like how to get the pig to the table, how the market works. And he was literally in the canned ham business, so. Yeah. Getting big to a table, that's a function of marketing. That's what I wanted to follow his footsteps. But along the way, I was taking classes and hanging out with people that were very techy because computers were all the rage at the time. My roommate had a mini computer in our dorm, and the idea of taking math and technology and physics classes because those classes actually, that content actually came easier to me than what some of the business stuff did. I still struggle with supply and demand and economics 101.
Yeah.
But yeah, who takes physics classes as electives just to keep their grade point up?
This will help if I take this difficult class, so I better take it. Yeah.
But so out of college, the idea of being involved in tech was really very attractive, and so Silicon Valley, was calling at the time, and that was kind of a fun place to be.
And how long were you there?
So I worked for about 7 years, working for a combination of Apple, Compaq, Dell, Next, and it was a thrilling time because that's when things like the protocol wars and the operating system wars were happening, and I would get sent in to study and to make sense of what was happening with the those complex battles over standards, and to be able to really dig into what was the difference between one technology and another technology, and then bring it back to the business people so they could make decisions about what strategy to run with. And so the kind of an aptitude for technology and the ability to make it understandable, that was sort of something I realized I could do. I thought that everybody could do it. I thought that's what you're supposed to do.
Yeah.
But it turns out that ability to make things understandable and put them in and help people determine what strategy to take was key for me to meet a whole lot of interesting people out that were in Silicon Valley and then since, and that again helping people understand, well, what should we do from a policy standpoint? What should we do from a strategy standpoint? What should I do from a career standpoint? Where are things going? I didn't really realize it at the time, but I was, in Silicon Valley and around some mentors, will say that, really were key people, movers and shakers in the industry at the time, in the IT space. And I didn't, I didn't take it for granted, but I didn't realize that, like, through osmosis almost, I was learning a lot of really interesting lessons that we're now able to kind of use here in our industry.
So, Rick, is there anyone there, like in the Silicon Valley area, like you'd mentioned, some of those mentors being highly influential, whoever they were there any ones that you care to name that were particularly helpful to you?
There was a time when I was working for a guy by the name of Kevin Compton out in Silicon Valley, and he just had this vision of, and he helped to steer me towards more the communications and the interpretation role and the presenting. And Kevin at that time, he was working for a company called Businessland, which was a really interesting company out there that was a reseller of technology and an influential one. But he left and he went to work for what we thought was like, he's going to work for a bank. I don't understand what it is. It was Kleiner Perkins. He was one of the first venture capital all-stars. He funded a company that changed its name to Netscape, and the rest is history. So he was one of the key people who made the decision to fund what had been called Mosaic, and they changed their name to Netscape. I also got to work, when I was working on the release of the Next Cube, and for people who know the history of Silicon Valley, that's where Steve Jobs went to reinvent the computer business, along with Avi Tavanian and a couple others.
That's right.
Being on that team that, and I was just a technical writer and helping to create distribution strategy for them. But being around that team and then realizing what that became, so I guess I'm telling multiple stories of people that I've been around that have had an influence, and then they turn out to be really, really rock stars in the industry, and what they brought to tech and brought to society is pretty interesting. So you look back at it and you try and make notes of, okay, what did I learn back then? While I was unconsciously unconsciously just doing my job. Um, and again, a lot of that then relates to what we're doing now and what we're seeing in terms of a massive change in our industry. And by being around those people, and another person that I got to meet just briefly was Bob Metcalf, and Metcalf's law is of course something that affects, everybody knows that, how the value of the internet multiplies almost as compelling as what Moore's law is. People quote it all the time. So there were a few people out there that were pretty interesting influences for sure.
Well, and a lot of times they say so much of what you learn isn't necessarily taught, it's caught. And when you're in environments of highly effective people, you may not necessarily be sitting there taking notes. It's like, okay, I noticed when he did this, so it was because of this, and well, that's a good strategy. And so I'm going to make sure to just write this down, and then I'll put it on a note card and review it every day. It's like, it's not that kind of mentality. It's just being in it and being, soaked in it, almost like swimming. You come out wet, can't help it.
It's a perfect way to describe it. Caught, not taught. It's like, look what I caught. And that,
yeah.
And in what we're, what we're advocating for now in quote our industry is maybe even more exciting to me than what was happening with the evolution of IT technology. Because I always kind of had this perspective of IT is basically it's email. It's
Yeah.
IT enables something else. That's what it does. By itself, it is just a tool. How it impacts different industries and different OTs, we'll say, is really the key. And so another influential person I met somewhere along talked about how I heard this interview on the radio, and I was like, man, I gotta track this guy down. Who is this Michael Porter? How technology impacts different businesses, and how it had not really yet had much of an impact on real estate, energy, education, but it had. So IT had its effect, or was having a dramatic effect on things like distribution and finance and banking and things like that, but hadn't really yet had an impact. This goes back a ways, but it turns out that Michael, I looked him up later, Michael Porter is, one of those
5 forces model and all that. Yeah.
Yeah. All that. But that helped me sort of focus, to say, hey, my obsession with, and what I knew about controls and automation and the emerging, IoT, we call it now, that, we really could, society would really benefit and people would benefit from getting our technology act together and applying some of the principles of technology to this space. And so for whatever crazy reason, because that's like a curse, decided to try and take this on. That's what we're trying to do with the Coalition for Smarter Buildings, and working with a bunch of really ambitious companies, either a consulting role or a business strategy or business development role, to try and bring the examples of this, newer technology to the market, and to provide owners and customers what they really want in the terms of the benefits of a new way to think about technology in our space.
So after 7 years at Silicon Valley, that's all you're trying to do? After 7 years at Silicon Valley, what came after that?
So I can't remember exactly what the sequence was, but I ended up needing to have a real job, and so I needed to be back in the Midwest for a bunch of different reasons. So I ended up in a combination of living in St. Louis and now Kansas City for the last 15 or 20 years, and I found my way back to work for a little company called Johnson Controls, which you probably heard of. And spent 10 years. Yeah, spent 10 years there, in an attempt to move Johnson Controls into more of systems and services role, and focused on solutions and kind of open systems, working in the smart city and smart grid space. And in that time, it was obvious that technology wasn't quite where it needed to be to have some of these plug and play and interoperability concepts. And Johnson Controls, a lot of times, and some of the other big four companies are thought of as these proprietary walled garden spaces. But I've always had a more optimistic view of those. Some of the bigger players is that when the time's right, and when the opportunity is right, they embrace the multi-vendor reality of the world that the owners live in, and but technology has really been holding us back in terms of having that plug and play, mix and match, vendor and component interoperability. But I left Johnson Controls, and for the past 7 to 8 years, I've been working with a variety of startups that show promise in this quest for that interoperable sort of plug and play, interchangeable parts kind of desire that owners are getting better at articulating. And I feel like the market is going to respond because it's becoming more obvious that what the desire is to have that interoperability, we'll call it.
So you started off at Honeywell. That was before your California days, and that was in the controls division. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so you kind of had this understanding of controls, but then you come back after 7 years into the industry. What was the hook into Johnson? I mean, were you looking for something back in controls in HVAC?
Yeah. Again, the idea of where to hook technology. What industry could there be some impact? And maybe naively, I thought, technology's finally at a point where it can actually have this impact. And again, inside of Johnson Controls. Now, back to college and even before, I had this, weird obsession with controls. And it goes back as far as 1978 is when there was this protocol introduced called X10, if anybody's heard of it. And it was a way to it was a first version of home automation. And, I was in junior high, and I would walk past the Radio Shack store, and I saw this home automation kit with the X10 protocol, and I still have on my shelf behind here one of the first ones that I ever bought. So that idea of control, turning on and off lights and doing things and turn on and off plug loads, kind of went back to even before 1980. And that was part of the reason I went to Honeywell. And then at Honeywell, of course, you don't go to Honeywell without spending 6 weeks in Minneapolis and learning how to do pneumatics. Which was, that was interesting. But it was right, then in the 80s was the DDC revolution, where everything was switching from pneumatics to digital control. So then I go to Silicon Valley, learn all about technology, have all that immersion, and then come back to the controls business and find out nothing much had changed.
Right. Yeah.
We're
very
still
slow.
Yeah, very, very slow. But the concept of sequences and fundamentals of control is something that, when you're doing it with pneumatics, you learn the fundamentals of how to sequence and how to control different mechanical systems and the importance. And and then now we switch to doing it with digital. Now we're switching to do it more computers, and it just kind of. But the fundamentals of what you guys still have to do from a sequencing standpoint is still there. The fact that we can now use data overlays to be able to more articulate, more precisely match supply and demand is remarkable. But fundamentally, we're still we're still trying to move air and heat and cool air.
Yeah.
So anyway, I did a little bit of a retracing of steps to kind of connect some of the dots of some of the legacy of this obsession, this crazy obsession with trying to turn stuff on and off.
Right. Yeah. Exactly the way we want to do it. Yeah. Anyone can go flip a switch. But is that really how you want to do it? No, I don't think so. So 10 years at Johnson, yeah, I've heard, the big four, they're really easy to harp on, but they've also done a lot of really good for the industry. And they've put in a lot of processes internal to them to, some people would say, you talked about the 6 weeks in Minneapolis. It's kind of that indoctrination sort of mindset while also training from a functional standpoint. So you kind of grow this affinity towards the brand or the company you're working for. I think Johnson does a good job for a lot of people, bringing them into Johnson and making them truly Johnson people. Was that your experience working for Johnson also? I mean, fairly positive.
It absolutely was, and I maybe had an even more interesting journey with them because they promoted me into a role where I was managing a region, but I was also helping the company expand its workforce. And in doing that, every engineer that graduates from A&M or Purdue or Iowa State was already working in the industry. So you had to find people from outside of the industry. And there was a big push for diversity at that time, and I got put onto that diversity task force of how to take the good of Johnson Controls and what Johnson Controls was doing for owners and customers globally, and then bring new people into that and bring their perspectives into that. And what I learned along the way is that when you bring people with a different background than just the engineer mindset, you get different questions that they ask, really brilliant questions that, question, well, what are we doing? Why are we doing it this way? And how can we continue to, evolve as a company or evolve as a society? And that diversity focus was sincere, and I think it worked in sort of broadening the way that Johnson Controls could work with the community of customers, as well as that, as an industry, we've probably been pretty guilty of inventing stuff for ourselves and then go selling it to ourselves and then listening to ourselves. And it kind of had this self-fulfilling effect of what was happening. And by thinking about, hey, how's it being interpreted by different kinds of audiences, not necessarily always just the engineering technical side. And and more decisions are being made about technology implementation by a broader set of people from the community, whether it's a school board or an executive board of a company. Those are more diverse. You can't just go sell to engineering companies anymore. You have to.
That's right.
You have to sell to the community. So, and I felt like Johnson Controls has done a good job of figuring out what is the community want and how to deliver things that they want. Now, balance that with the fact that there's an opportunity right now for smaller, more dynamic, and more fast-moving companies to go provide solutions that go even further or go deeper or go faster, better, cheaper than what the bigs can do. And but I'm really optimistic about the fact that the smaller, more nimble companies have a huge place in this next generation of technology evolution. And I think that large institutions that are sometimes customers of the Big Four are asking those big companies, those legacy companies, for more dynamic solutions, and that's going to come through partnerships and through opening up standards and from a new kind of technology and data model that we're sort of advocating. But everybody's going to have to be at the table. It's not going to be us versus them. It's going to be a more collaborative approach to tech.
You talk about this bubble of us making things for ourselves, selling it to ourselves, and then telling ourselves that it's working really well. I mean, really, ultimately, that's a definition of groupthink. And all the literature says that groupthink is going to hold you back from success and innovation. And I think there's this mantra of the OT industry, the HVAC industry is 15, 20 years behind the IT industry. And I think it's kind of like, well, I think we've caught up in our own way, but now it's like the offerings have to catch up. So it's like the language has caught up, but now the offerings have to catch up. But to bring those offerings up, there is this, it's like, people have to start asking for it. Where do you think the bottleneck is in having those innovations catch up to where IT is?
So, I mean, that's interesting that the barriers and the bottlenecks is something that we were asked to help identify by the Department of Energy, and of all things, the White House Council on Environmental Quality. They came and met with us and said, what are the bottlenecks, and why don't we have more technology helping to solve whatever the use case is? Why don't we have more proliferation of technology? And the bottlenecks we identified were that interoperability just isn't being asked for, those interchangeable parts, and people don't know exactly what interoperability means. So that was one thing, and that we're not using data to do analytics and optimization very often. We're using IoT to do some interesting things, but we're not seeing enough proliferation of analytics. And then another bottleneck was that there's no sort of replicable recipes or examples of specifications that can help people get onto the same page. And that the old ways of procuring were somewhat of a bottleneck as well, for people to be able to say, hey, I see something new and I want to buy it, but I honestly, inside of my organization, I don't have a way of being able to buy it. Right. So that's another bottleneck. And then, the education and workforce is another one. So we identified these 5 sort of bottlenecks. What's stopping technology from having a more rapid growth and momentum, and how it's affecting our space. Now that so taking on those things is a shift in mentality. It's a shift in focus of what different companies are doing, and but it's also finding examples of where it is working and highlighting those. So that's a huge part about what we've been focused on is trying to get people's heads around those obstacles.
Well, and another major obstacle, Rick, which I think falls inside of one of your categories, is an engineer or an engineering company has 2 primary goals, right? To leverage their billable hours as much as possible and to reduce risk. And it takes time to research new things. So that's an investment. And it takes risk to write into a spec or a design something new. And that's scary.
It absolutely. But if we can reduce that risk by showing that that particular capability is desired, and people will pay for it, and that's but it's kind of this chicken and egg thing of, if you don't show what it is, you can't get somebody to say, I want that. And that's part of where, in reducing that risk of, should I develop this feature? Should I spend this time on this software? If you can reduce the risk by saying, yeah, there's a huge market for that, and it looks like this, that's a key part of what we know is an obstacle. So part of what we've done with the specifications work is to say, okay, well, we're going to create some framework documents that say, here's where you ask for, or is if you're on the customer side of the equation, it's like, here's where you put your desires of what you want the technology to do, and you put it in this format, and it's compliant with how architects and engineers and construction managers are used to looking at what your requirements are. And then if you are the technology provider, you can look at that document and say, oh, well, here they're articulating that they want these two systems to work together, and that's part of the scope. I can't skip it. I can't, and then you'll say, oh yeah, we'll get to that later. It says it right here in the master format spec. And so getting into the weeds a little bit, we've tried to create places where somebody can say, yes, here's what I want, and the engineers can write it into a specification format, and then a little bit of show and tell. Here's some examples of where things are working together, and you kind of give people that ability to say, I want what she's having. Be able to say, that's what we want, but I want it applied to this building. And then that gives everybody more of a sense of, oh, well, great. The market is articulating what they want. I was thinking about designing that product that way anyway. Now I have more clarity about, yes, I need to build that feature in. And everybody can agree because I got some things to point to. So I think that's going to be a big help in getting past some of these obstacles.
So whether your time at Johnson or any company since then, any of these startups, has there been someone that you've really looked up to, whether from a leadership perspective or just like a knowledgeable perspective? A lot of what you're talking about too is strategy and looking forward and building frameworks of understanding so you can then go take those complex things and break them down into manageable, understandable pieces that can be communicated. Are there other people that you've worked with that you feel like have modeled that well?
Yeah. And, over the past, 7 years or so, the exposure through different projects, exposure to other people in this multi-vendor world that are doing interesting things in the industry, that's been really influential. And, recently, John Petsy announced that he's retiring from the industry. But John and Anto and Ano and Tracy Markey and these other people that I'm lucky to call colleagues and friends have been very influential in showing that there's innovation that's happening inside and outside of the big four, and a great indication of there being people that are thinking this way, but need to have that reinforcement of there being a market for that, that new kind of, that new approach, and new kind of thinking, new kind of product. But to be able to have, people like I've described, and then, for a long time being, working with, the likes of, like I said, John Petsy and Jim Lee and now, more recently, some of the newer people that have come into the industry that are having a great impact, like Andrew Rogers and James Dice and yourself. It's like there's a lot of people that are having these conversations, and it's very, very encouraging. And James Dice, it's funny, the little, he's got the Nexus podcast, and he's got he's having an influence on the industry in a lot of different ways. It turns out that when he came out of college, he went to work for as an energy engineer for a company in St. Louis that was actually using one of the platforms that I had been had created for a customer called the state of Missouri, and he was using that at different universities and different clients. And so one of his first exposures to tools was something that a friend and I had created back in the Johnson Controls days. So some of what shaped him, I think I'm both to blame for. No,
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
I will
He's like,
take
this
no
has to
credit.
change. We need to fix this.
Yes,
That's what he
there's
was thinking.
there's got to be a better way, and he just said that anyway.
Yeah.
So when when we attend these different meetings of these industry people who are listening and talking and having conversations about the future of where we're going, that is really, really motivating and exciting. And so, getting new people into the industry that have different points of view is just back to my diversity concept or diversity focus. But we've got people from architecture firms like Dominique Davidson and Rory Barnwell that are on these conversations. We've got people from from the geospatial, the world of GIS data that are part of these conversations. And we've got people that are, great storytellers that are part of the conversation, whether that's Ken Sinclair or, people that are focused on doing things like what you're doing right here. And and we got a new media person that it's a great storyteller, Monica Davis. But the people that are coming to help tell the story, show their technology in a new context, and be advocates for what will be this sort of new era of how technology works. It's just exciting to have so many people coming to the table.
It is exciting. Like one of those groups I know you're a part of is the Monday Live group. So anyone listening to this that doesn't already know about Monday Live or listen, I mean, highly encouraged to go and participate in that. It's a closed Zoom chat, or at least a closed Zoom call, but then the chat is available to anyone that wants to participate or ask a question or make a comment. It's a helpful forum also, even just sometimes to listen while you're doing other work, because you get to hear these conversations from people like you and everyone else you mentioned, Anto, Ken, Mark Peacock, and to kind of hear. And there's a lot of experience there too in history, which is context setting for where we are now and where we're going. And you don't get that without listening to people that have been around for a long time and that are having those conversations. So I kind of see it as, we always wish that we could be a fly on the wall on conversations like that from people that know what they're talking about. Well, that's an opportunity to be a fly on the wall. And then also chat a question and maybe they'll say something about it. So, that's a good group. So are there other resources that you would recommend for someone new in the industry, either a new technician, a wire puller, a new engineer that's, not taking on projects yet? What are some places that you would say, go and look at these places and start building that context and knowledge for yourself?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as you said, the Monday Live, to give you some context from people who've been head down working on trying to solve problems and doing it both a combination of the old way and the new way. Monday Live, and all those sessions are recorded. Reading the things from James Dice, watching these things. There's a couple. Gartner started to do some research in this space, and then there's a organization called Harbor Research, and their papers and their thought leadership pieces are really compelling. And Glenn Allmendinger is becoming a key friend that is articulating where technology is going. But then I also say that you got to look at you got to learn the fundamentals of controls. I hate to say it, but doing field trips and looking at what is actually installed and understanding things from the owner standpoint of. I'm saddled with these 30-year-old buildings with 30-year-old controls, and you're trying to tell me I should be using high-end, software overlays to be able to do optimization, and I can't even see what the set points are remotely. So, kind of digging in and getting your hands dirty on seeing what the real control sequences are. I'm not saying go back and learn how pneumatics work. Certainly don't go all the way back to X10, but the understanding.
Yeah, hey, can I borrow that? Yeah, that controller behind you.
I've got X10.
Well, we've talked about this on the podcast before, but it's that concept of bucket time. You ever heard of bucket time?
Bucket time.
You go into a mechanical room. There's no seats. What do? You flip a bucket over and you sit on it, and it's like, that's bucket time.
Yeah.
And that's sitting there in front of the control panel with your computer plugged in, pulling up a software and seeing what the heck is going on. But that's also installing, whether it's, us going out and installing something like our Commander platform, where now, we always say even a sales guy can do it, right? All right, well, go show me. All right, so the sales guy will go out and flip the bucket upside down, sit down at their computer and make it happen. That kind of boots hit the ground experience is very key.
And that's so key. And we're kind of moving into the next frontier as well, where hands-on experience of actually understanding, when people say, oh, well, we're using Python to do modifications, it's like the people who are coming into the industry from the IT side, actually dig into that API documentation and look at, the good and the bad and the ugly of API first, movement. So dig into the details and get deep on any one subject. From Silicon Valley, one of the smart people out there, Pete Hayes, was an influence, said, know a lot about a little, and then, like every other person in Silicon Valley, be able to go really deep on one thing, which can just, sort of blow people away. That advice is not bad advice, but whatever the your area of expertise is, dig in, get your hands dirty on learning, how it really works and how it applies to these real buildings with these real challenges. That's the field trip mentality. You call it bucket time. I like that. I've always called it sort of field trips. Go to the field and see what's actually happening out there.
I was just gonna say, I can remember seeing, a lot of controls panels inside the building, in some closet somewhere. And then the first time I went up on a roof and saw a huge air handler unit, and they open up the side, and it's like, well, by golly, there's a controls panel there. I thought these were only in the building. It's like such a simple thing about where things are located and how things operate. You don't get that context sitting behind a computer doing, Teams calls all day.
It exactly. I took a picture of we opened up a panel of a 90-ton train unit. I was on the roof, and written in Sharpie was, I think it was, I don't have the picture with me, but I think it was from 0 to 2 was cooling mode, from 3 to 5 was fan only, and from 6 to 9 was heating mode. And that was the point, was that the only interface with that 90-ton unit was a 0 to 10 signal. And that just, when I tell that story, some people understand the kind of the comedy of it. It's just written in Sharpie inside the door of this huge unit. And
it might as well be chiseled in stone, Rick.
But just those, and then again, I love taking people that are new to the industry to the roof or to the mechanical closet, and then the questions that they ask, and then you have to figure out how to answer it to somebody who is not technical, or they're an IT person and incredibly technical, but not in our area, or they're very, very skilled at communications or policy making, but they need things to be put into terms that they can digest and then help move forward.
Or even the legacy versions of equipment that are out there, and all the different ideas that engineers have had along the years, and how each of them then play, into one that we're talking a lot about airflow recently, and we're installing an airflow measurement system, and we're looking at damper blades. And it's like, all the different kind of damper blade styles and looks and how it works, and the louvers, and, like part of you is just like, it goes back to standardizations. Like, we couldn't have just decided on one thing. Like, there's got to be all these different ones out there. But, that at the same time is part of the fun of going into all these different, you never know what you're going to get, right? A box of chocolates, a building of chocolates, what's in there. Have you ever been a part of like a mentoring program, like either receiving mentorship or giving mentorship?
So, I think that that's something that our industry needs to do more of, and that's something we're trying to, with the Coalition for Smarter Buildings, is something we're trying to foster.
Mm.
And I've been part of it, officially at Johnson Controls, which was great, and a couple other companies along the way. Um, but back to the big companies, the big companies isn't necessarily where everybody's focus and energy is now. The smaller companies that don't have the time to, have official mentorship. So we have to get
Right.
that from maybe outside of the industry. And that's where some of the resources, like what you've mentioned with Monday Live and with Nexus and such. Um, and, and there's another organization called BIG, which is Building Intelligence Group, run by Brad
Mm.
Colton, my friend from Minneapolis. They're providing those opportunities for those conversations and those sort of more informal mentorships. Um, I've got a handful of people that I talk to on a regular basis that are from outside of the industry that I'm having fun with and trying to challenge myself to be able to teach them and keep them excited about, their possible careers in this space.
Mm.
But I think as an organization, or excuse me, as an industry and as industry organizations, we need to be more intentional on that. Uh, Here we are, we've talked about for however long, we've talked about a bunch of different resources, a bunch of different stories, but we need to be more intentional about collecting and organizing these resources for that next generation. Because we can
Yeah.
get people excited. Like I said, my stepson just went to work for a big engineering firm here in town, and his specialty is GIS, geospatial information systems, and trying to give him the context and excitement and where do you go besides your bosses inside of 1898, the company he works for.
Hmm.
Besides that, where do you go to get these resources? And we need to step up and create a better catalog of where those are and how that's organized.
Yeah, when it comes to mentorship, I think the matchmaking is part of it, right? And some of it's going to be organic. You're going to meet them at trade shows. You're going to meet them in these groups. Other times it may be more formal and say, "Hey, we're gonna assign Tim to Rick. Great. So you guys just go meet. Cool. What do you think are some helpful ways to think about mentorship if you're being mentored or if you are mentoring someone?"
Well, and that's where conversation starters around what are the opportunities, what's this future, what are career opportunities, and putting some structure around those conversations. Again, we're kind of conveniently using those 5 areas that we identified as obstacles as conversations of. So where could you focus to help apply yourself, and to ask questions of how can I learn more about the opportunity that is presented in these obstacles. So whether it's the interoperability challenge that we're using the smarter stack and the horizontal architecture that from Nexus, and we're talking about how technology can be more loosely coupled and more layered approach, and so then you can have conversations about that. You can have conversations about how the Division 25 specification can be used, and these can be sort of conversation starters and discussion points, and then one of our other key tenets is that workforce development. And there's a lot being done in there where in the workforce segment where volunteers for the coalition are putting together and bringing together more examples of career tracks, of certification possibilities. And again, these conversation buckets of that can be focus areas for how to identify what opportunities are in the market, opportunities career-wise, opportunity from a technology standpoint. Another key part of what I've learned, and probably wish I've learned earlier, is the whole innovation cycle and how how investors are looking at this space with a longing eye
Mm-hmm.
when
Mm-hmm.
how to run a startup. That's a really interesting thing that's not talked about. It's not one of our buckets of the coalition, but um, how to gain fame and popularity through working for startups, and how does that whole business work?
To win friends and influence VCs. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. And how to
Yeah.
frame what we are doing as something that is exciting, and whether you want to, just bootstrap, or whether you just want to get paid by the hour, or whether you want to go get investment and then take that route. But understanding the different paths to having an impact on a market is a really interesting thing that we don't really talk about enough. I feel like.
I know there's a lot of excitement around startups in our industry. There's kind of also, I would say, an undertone of skepticism. We've all been to, whether it's AHR or IBCon, these, innovative shows. These new big splashy vendors come in, and then they're gone in a year or two. And that could, I think, feed jadedness, but at the same time, I think there are things to learn from there, or from them. What's going well, what hasn't, what doesn't go well. But do you see a real potential in startups coming in and really disrupting the industry, or will they come in and just kind of find their niche and thrive there?
I do think that there's opportunity for startups in it if they understand kind of where in the stack they can have their impact, and where some of these bottlenecks, where some of those bottlenecks can be broken loose through some pretty simple, focused new tech. And that isn't going to necessarily, that innovation is not going to come from the bigger players who don't have a budget for research and development. So the research and development has to come from outside. And there's been some interesting articles I've read about the ebb and flow of research and development inside of an industry or inside of a company. I'm too busy selling, or too busy engineering and manufacturing. I don't have time or budget to do research and development. And wow, there's these innovative companies out there that are doing it. I'm just going to throw a little bit of money into them and have them, go out on the fringe and innovate. And then when economic conditions change, some of those big companies bring that R&D back in house. But there's no question that the big companies, the established companies, are being told by their customer base, hey, we need innovation. And if you're not doing it internally, you better be investing in what some of the startups are doing. So,
Right.
if you look at it from that perspective, there's always a certain percentage of the economy that needs to be invested in R&D. And whether that is being incented by how those investments are treated from a tax standpoint inside of a large company, or whether that's being incented by ambitious VCs, or whether it's being modeled and incented by policymakers, there's just this reality of there needs to be some amount of the economy that is reinvested in research and development. So those innovations, and right now, we're again looking at those bottlenecks and those focus areas. We can see how innovations, this next frontier of innovations, can be really useful to our space, because people are getting better at articulating that I want to be able to use the data from this sensor and the data from this weather forecast, and I want to be able to, and the data from XYZ and XYZ, I want to be able to use those pieces of data and have a new kind of decision that I can make based on these different inputs. And that concept of composability, or just-in-time sort of solutions, is pretty obvious that that's where technology is going. And when we use iPhones or when we use different apps that are now becoming just common, we see examples of new sorts of solutions that are a little bit of data from here, a little bit of data from there, a little bit of data from here, pulled together to be able to make a new kind of app and answer a new kind of question, provide a new kind of solution. And and just that simple, that's where our customer base wants us to go. They want us to drag the old pneumatic system, the old X10 system.
I was just gonna say, I mean, it's the X10 mentality. I mean, it's like, this is what's available in the consumer world. Oh, I should be able to expect this in the commercial world as well. And it's leading the way.
Yeah, and that concept of composability or headless architectures and API first architectures is something that that is becoming more and more precisely articulated, and that should take the risk out of the people developing it. They want to develop it, they want to go there. Yeah. And investors can see that that's where things need to go. So that pretty excited about what this next frontier is. And again, we may finally see the technology impacts, as Michael Porter said, we may finally accomplish how technology impacts our sector.
Yeah, one day, hopefully. Well, and I think we're seeing it, Rick. I know we're seeing it. The conversations we're having, it's happening more and more. The change is happening. How do we help it, right? How do we not speed it up just for the sake of speed, but speed it up for the sake of the goals that consumers and customers are asking for. So, Rick, however much time left you have in your career, what are some of the things that that you want to accomplish? What's next for Rick?
Well, I do think that continuing to bring new people into the industry, chasing that goal of how interoperability and composability manifests itself in new solutions. I'm not going anywhere. I may talk about stories from the 70s and the 80s, but I've got an 11-year-old that is going to need to still be put through college. So
that's right.
But I do believe that this next frontier of 3 to 5 years is going to be very exciting. But we're going to need that interoperability. We're going to need that data from that GIS system, and we're going to need that data from these other systems to be able to be composable into new solutions. So what I'm really going to be focusing on is trying to find those examples of where we can give people a glimpse of that now, and then rally everybody to the table, policymakers, investors, innovators, legacy companies, bringing it all together to be able to show glimpses of what this next frontier can look like. And then another part of it that we're also doing is trying to put things into context of, so what's the impact going to be from a operational energy and capital and life cycle standpoint? Put things into the context of the financial decisions that people are making. So that's going to be my focus, is to try and bring context and bring conversations together from those different groups. And I'm excited as the dickens. I do know people that are retiring, and some of the people, my brother is a bunch younger and he's been teaching for 25 years. He's going to retire and go camping. And I'm like, oh, God help him.
Yeah. Have fun. Yeah. No, Rick, I think you have a really unique background in terms of like the length of time that you've spent, kind of both in the establishment, but then also in a highly innovative driven environment also, and kind of merging those two together with a fairly clear vision of how you want to then make a lasting impact on the industry. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the podcast, because that's the kind of mentality that everyone needs to have, is how, what can I learn now so that I could apply it in the future? What changes can I make now to make a lasting legacy impact? And I'll also say this, from like a personal standpoint, I remember the first time I met you a few years ago, you're working for a competitor trying to make waves in the industry, this and that. You're asking me questions, and there's always this feeling out period, right? Of, So who are you, and like, what do you do, and like, what are you really after here? And I was almost disarmed by your, like, willingness to have this conversation, and like, you were complimentary in one regard, and you were saying we need to do this together as an industry in another regard, and I'm just like, okay. I mean, I think, like, this is a guy that's thinking very similar to the way that I'm thinking. And I just, like, from that very first conversation, it's like at a table in front of, potential customers or whatever it was, I was just like, man, like this, I need to know more about Rick. And then we saw you in the lobby, I think at the hotel later, we had another further conversation. Just really, really appreciate the way that you approach people, how personable you are, how authentic you are. And again, it's that kind of person. It's a person like you that we want to be then having conversations like Coalition for Smarter Buildings, and laying that foundation, and then trying to do it in a way that's both tactically logical, but then from a communication standpoint, compelling, and you enroll others to join you along the way. So thank you for everything you're doing. Really, really appreciate that.
Likewise, everything you're doing is wonderful as well. And I do remember that very first conversation, and those are examples of the kind of conversation that I really cherish. So, and I appreciate the opportunity to do this, what you're doing with this podcast. It's tremendous.
All right, well, that wraps this episode of the Building Geniuses podcast, a production of KMC Controls. If you've enjoyed this conversation, we encourage you to subscribe and share. And if there's anyone that you know who should be on the podcast, tag them in the comments or reach out to us, and we'll tag them in the comments. And as always, we appreciate you listening. Until next time, learn something new, teach someone something, and build your inner genius.